Okay, this is the introductory slide. In fact, on the left is an image that I won't be talking about today. It's from the ephemera collection of the National Library, a postcard from the beginning of the 20th century called Khurban, the destruction. This is a postcard you sent out with a message on the back, I suppose. And the book on the right is a book in the National Library collection. In fact, that's not an image of the actual book in the library's collection. It's an image of the same book, but I couldn't find the library's book, at least to take a picture of it. So this is from a website called the Internet Archive, which is, anyone who does not know about it, is a fantastic site, and I recommend you going to it. Anyway, these are things from the National Library, and I'd like to thank the National Library for the invitation to speak in the reading room. Now, I've been studying and working in the National Library for 37 years, and I've always known the reading room as a place where you don't talk. And in fact, the only place in the library where you don't talk. But the library is transforming and has transformed into a very different place from what I knew as a graduate student. It's now alive with culture and public education and all sorts of wonderful things. This reading room series of lectures is a good example of that. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. I'd also like to thank the library's staff, particularly Maria Baragil and Doron Levin, for aiding me with the more technical aspects of this talk. And thank you all for coming. Here in Israel, it is close to the end of the day. Some of us have been fasting for close to 24 hours. So I hope my talk will help my Israeli friends and me finish the day in a helpful way. And those in other time zones experience the day with perhaps unexpected content. For Tisha B'Av is certainly one of those days in the Hebrew calendar that you experience with your whole body and mind. I'm you are? I'm sorry. What are you seeing with my screen? Oh, you mean the PowerPoint? It doesn't matter. Okay, just a minute. Escape. Sorry, fellas. Are you still sharing screen?
Yes, we can still see the presentation.
Okay, good. Okay, so let me introduce myself. I'm Jonathan Price. I teach classics and ancient history in Tel Aviv. And for many years, I've dealt with Josephus, the Jewish Greek historian of the 1st century CE, who was an eyewitness to the destruction of the Second Temple. And he has a lot to say about it. And he will make an appearance in this talk. It's nice to be invited to give a non-academic lecture where I can talk with you about ideas and texts and even emotions without footnotes and the neuroses of scholarship. But also, I don't intend to give a preachy drasha, which is very common on the Tisha B'Av, which is not to denigrate the intense introspection that Tisha B'Av inspires. Usually on Tisha B'Av, rabbis, teachers, preachers talk about the destruction of the 2 temples, the reasons for it, and they talk sometimes about the wicked Babylonians and the wicked Romans, but more they talk about the Jewish causes of the destruction, the Jewish lapses and sins that led God to destroy or allow the destruction of the 2 temples. And you hear homilies that commonly dwell on the famous rabbinic explanation of sinat chinam, baseless hatred, which brought down the Second Temple, even though that generation was engaged in Torah study and mitzvot observance and charity, which shows that baseless hatred is equivalent in weight to the worst sins possible: idol worship, sexual immorality, and bloodshed. I myself have given such lectures. And it's worthwhile to discuss every year, even in less stressed times in the Hebrew calendar, the state of the Jewish people, whether we are more divided by hate than bound together by love. But I don't come here to preach or offer moral instruction. What I'd like to talk about is the trauma caused by the destruction of the second and last temple in Jerusalem. as experienced by the actual survivors and the generation after them. That is what went through their minds and hearts, so far as we can tell from first century Jewish literature, as they saw the temple go up in flames and had to figure out how to live afterwards. I'll be talking about books written by Jews in the decades immediately after the destruction of the temple. This includes Josephus, who may be familiar to you, as well as other books from the same time, which may be less familiar to some of you. These books were trying to process the trauma of the destruction. And they all deal in one way or another with the real existential, moral, philosophical, theological questions that are some of the most enduring and difficult questions which practically define our existence as Jews. That is theodicy, God's justice, how to live with trauma and disaster, our place in a divine historical plan, the relevance of ancient prophecies, the promises of the historical present, sin and redemption, things like that. So I'm interested today in how the trauma was processed. We're still processing it in our generation with fasting on Tisha B'Av, but how the first generations after the destruction and before Bar Kokhba, 60 years later, processed it. So, okay, did that work? Do you now see the next slide?
You see it, although not in presentation mode, but that's because you have it set up with annotations. So this would be the largest we could see it, unless you have another mode for presentation.
I see. Well, if it doesn't bother you when you can see it, I think I'll just keep it like this so as not to complicate matters. Is this good enough?
Yes, sir.
Okay. This, by the way, is the painting hanging in the Israel Museum of Poussin, imagining the destruction of the temple. This is Titus on his white horse. It's hard for us to imagine the psychic and spiritual suffering experienced by the Jews of the first century, especially those who saw the temple going up in flames. And then they saw the Romans systematically leveling it to the ground. It's difficult because of the distance in time and our unfamiliarity with temple ritual and routine, and that is the temple as an existence in our religious lives. But it's also difficult because of the immeasurable trauma of the 20th century, which we give a unique meaning. Now, I don't come here to compare the destruction to the Holocaust. The Romans destroyed the temple and many of its defenders, but they didn't engage in a systematic program of annihilation of the Jewish people. Moreover, the Romans were suppressing rebellion, albeit very brutally, whereas the Nazis hunted down Jews because they were Jews who just wanted to live their lives. The Romans didn't do anything like that. In fact, this topic, comparing the destruction to the Holocaust, is very intensely discussed and debated in scholarship today, whether or not the destruction can be compared to the Holocaust, and especially the Jewish people's reaction to the two cataclysms. And I won't linger on that debate here, nor do I intend to engage in a real comparison between the two things, but I bring this up in order to say that the depth of the trauma suffered by first century Jews, the immeasurable psychological, emotional, spiritual impact, the tear in the fabric of their existence, losing the thing that defined them, and their bewilderment, perplexity, crisis of faith, questioning God's justice, their grief at total loss. This must have had a lot in common with the trauma experienced by Jews because of the Holocaust. One big difference is that, so far as we know, no one in the first century gave up belief in God. I know of no first century equivalent of Richard Rubinstein after Auschwitz, which proclaims the death of the covenant after the Holocaust. Atheism or denial of God doesn't seem to have been an option in antiquity, and God's presence at the destruction of the temples couldn't be questioned because it was his house. We have and can read a vivid detailed eyewitness description of the last days, hours, and minutes of the Jews defending the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 CE. And then a painful description of what it looked like going up in flames. That eyewitness is, of course, the Jewish historian known as Flavius Josephus, who began life as Yosef ben Matityahu, Yosef, the son of Matityahu, who came from an aristocratic priestly family in Jerusalem. He fought as a general on the Jewish side. He was captured and held in the Roman camp during the entire war. He was in Jerusalem in 70 and witnessed the siege, the famine, the destruction of the temple, after which he went back to Rome and spent the last 30 years of his life writing a voluminous history of the Jews and Judaism. And from his account of the temple's burning, we can almost imagine the desperate thoughts of those defending the temple. He describes people who had rushed to the temple to be with the priests and the Jewish soldiers there, taking anything that came to hand, sockets from doors, burning pieces of wood and throwing them at the Roman soldiers. And then when the Roman onslaught continued, plunging themselves into the flames or destroying themselves in other ways. Remember their unshakable belief that God would in no way abandon his house and his people. He was waiting for that critical moment to intervene, to vanquish the evil foe and to save the temple and establish a new age of peace and prosperity on earth. The Jews believed, or many of the Jews at that time, especially those who took place in the rebellion, believed that this was the end of time. This was the promised redemption and restored sovereignty of Israel that would come about, on the one hand, through suffering, war, turmoil, pain, but these were just birth pangs. And the defenders must have been thinking, we suffered so much. We've passed through critical moments. Now show us a sign. So the end didn't come. God didn't save us on Shiva Sabra Tammuz, on the 17th of Tammuz, when the sacrifices ended in the temple. Maybe that was the time to come down. We thought that might be the time. Maybe now is the time when we see the porticos around the temple torched that God will appear. Or maybe now, after that didn't happen, when the fires reach the gates, or now when its fires has crossed the outer courtyard and so forth. Now must be the time, the moment for the miracle and the promised redemption. When they realized that the miracle would not come and the promise would not be fulfilled, that's when they jumped into the flames. Josephus saw this and described it. And he also saw many people dying by the sword with their gaze fixed on the temple. And this particularly struck him. That's why he put it in his history. And this is what I mean by the grief and incomprehension and psychic pain comparable to the reactions to the Holocaust in the 20th century. And it was the expectation of the end of time, the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, that was a major motivation for the rebellion against Rome in the first century. There were many reasons for the Jewish revolt against Rome. This is a totally different lecture. They include Roman oppression in the provinces, economic stress, and many other factors. But for a small nation to take up arms against a world empire of enormous power, they had to be armed also with the belief that God was on their side, that he would fight by their side as he did with the Maccabees, who also were faced a huge empire that attacked the temple. But they prevailed because God came to the rescue with miracles and extraordinary triumphs. And it's no accident that many Jews in the first century rebelling against Rome called themselves Maccabees. And because in the first century, in the struggle against Rome, there was a widespread belief that this was a moment of destiny. In all sources available, in rabbinic midrash, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in Josephus, and in a set of Jewish books written in the decades after the destruction that I'll talk about later in this presentation, it's obvious that a central ideological or theological motivation for the war itself was the belief that a prophecy in the book of Daniel was just now, at this moment, being realized, and that we Jews had to keep its realization, had to help its realization, almost like midwives. So you might remember in the book of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He had a disturbing and puzzling dream, which he wished his wise men to interpret. But he said to them, in order to test your wisdom, I won't tell you what my dream is. Tell me what my dream was, and then interpret it for me. Of course, on their failure to do the impossible, he sentenced them all, including Daniel, to death. That night, Daniel saw everything in a vision, and the next day, he both revealed and explained the dream to the king, who was impressed. And again, I won't go through all the details of the dream, but you might remember that the dream, he dreamt of a huge figure with a head of gold, and he had 4 parts to him of decreasing of materials of decreasing value. And the 4th one, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And then, this is crucial, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it smote the image on his feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. So there were an image of 4 sections, and a 5th stone, mysterious stone, that smashed the legs of the 4th, and the whole thing came toppling down. Daniel's interpretation of this was as follows. He said that the 4 parts of the statue are 4 kingdoms, by which he comprehends all of world history. All world history has been comprehended by a succession of 4 kingdoms. And the 4th kingdom, strong as iron, will eventually be crushed. And the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, nor shall its sovereignty be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all those other kingdoms. That's the prophecy. Now, Daniel was writing before Rome's full power became known in the East. So the author of Sefer Daniel was thinking of a different 4th or last empire, not Rome. But this prophecy became the basis of the Jewish and Christian apocalyptic belief, and it underpinned the fervor in the first centuries of the Common Era, when the interpretation prevailed that the 4th empire, the one of iron, was Rome, and that the stone that broke everything apart was the Messiah, through whom, as Daniel says here, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, nor shall its sovereignty be left to another people. Now, other parts of the Bible, of course, fueled messianic fervor among the Jews at this time, verses of Isaiah and Zechariah and others. And Josephus also mentions non-biblical prophecies that didn't make it into the Bible, that motivated people to rebel. But the main idea was the same. God has not only sanctioned the present effort, but even predicted it and mandated it. And this prophecy of the 4 empires is really prevalent. You find it in so many sources from the time. Now, Josephus. Let me say a few words about Josephus. These are not pictures of Josephus. Okay, these are not pictures of Josephus. The one on the left is a famous image of Josephus, as it were, which was produced for the equally famous and popular translation into English of all of Josephus's works by the 18th century English eccentric and genius named William Whiston. Maybe not a genius, but certainly eccentric. He was a professor of mathematics in Cambridge, and he translated all of Josephus's works from Greek into English. And this is the image of Josephus produced for his 18th translation in the 18th century. People who like to talk about Orientalism, this is like the dream, the perfect image to just all the how Western imagination orientalized Jews. The image on the right is also not Josephus, although you sometimes find, especially on irresponsible websites, this is Josephus. In fact, this is a real first century bust, a Roman bust, which has been unidentified for 2,000 years until a scholar came along and said this must be Josephus, apparently based on the fact he has curly hair and a big nose. But in fact, this is not Josephus. These are just the 2 images that are often presented as Josephus, but we'll use them to represent Josephus because we don't know. He had statues of himself put up actually in Rome, but none of them survived. He was a deeply religious man, deeply religious Jew. And as a leader of the rebellion, he had to prove his bona fide. So at least enough people at the time, in 66, when the war broke out, his contemporaries accepted him as being with the program. And I think this is debatable, and some of you Josephus scholars, if there are any logged on, may debate me on this, but I think it was a deeply believing Jew, really, to the end of his life. And he also believed, I believe, in the beginning of the war, that the prophecy in Daniel, which he knew very well, is coming true. I think he went with the flow. And after he was captured in Yodfat in Lower Galilee, in the first year of the war, he spent the rest of the war in the Roman army camp, where he saw everything. Then he was free to take it back to Rome, and he wrote 30 volumes of history, which was, among many other things, a kind of reaction to the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. Josephus was in struggle with himself, for he had to do the hardest thing. He had to revise his beliefs. He was also in struggle with other Jews, some of whom he felt had dangerous and theologically wrong views of the meaning of the destruction. And other Jews despised him and his policy of accommodation with the Romans, no matter what they thought about his theology. But I think he didn't stop believing. He believed, as a good Jew, that the prophecy in the Holy Book is true, is the truth. But he changed his mind about the interpretation. Our timing was off. And he says, or he hints this in several places in his writings, either in his own voice as an historian or in speeches he puts in the mouth of various historical actors. He claims that Jews must submit to Rome, not as a political, but really as a religious statement, because the Romans' prosperity is the sign of God's obvious favor. And how can we question God? He always says we have to submit. Then he always inserts in his Greek some subtle expression which means for now. We have to submit for now. God has passed the scepter of world rule to the Romans for now, and it's not permanent. Now, Josephus didn't want to be perceived by his Roman patrons as subversive, and during his life, a few accusers came to Rome from all points in the East to accuse him of just that, of collaboration and of subversion of the Roman emperors. None of them succeeded. But if he had a religious belief in Rome's eventual demise, near or distant, he did it, and he hid it in hints for anyone who was sensitive to the hint, and that would be a Jewish reader. So there isn't, and he believed, and I think he hinted that there was an after Romans time, which God would bring about. He does this, as I said, in subtle language that Jews would catch, but Romans probably wouldn't. And he also relates in detail the dream interpretation of Daniel in the 10th book of the Antiquities. He does this. Here we have actually from the National Library collection a Latin translation of the Jewish Antiquities produced in Augsburg, Germany in the 15th century. So in this book, the Jewish Antiquities, which is a history of Judaism in the world from literally the moment of creation until his day, in the 10th book, he relates the dream and interpretation of Daniel. He could have skipped it. There's no reason why he had to put it in. He skipped many parts of the Bible, but he tells of the succession of 4 empires, making very explicit that the Romans are the 4th and the last world empire. Now, he was coy about the meaning of the enigmatic stone, which will smash the feet of the last empire. And this is what he says about it. He says, Daniel also revealed to the king the meaning of the stone, but I have not thought it proper to relate this, since I am expected to write of what is past and done, and not of what is to be. This is actually sort of not true, but this is what he says here. If, however, there is anyone who has taken so keen a desire for exact information that he will not stop short of inquiring more closely what wishes to learn about hidden things that are to be, let him take the trouble to read the book of Daniel, which he will find among the sacred writings. Now, he knew that hardly any Roman reader would actually go find a copy of the Septuagint or an early Latin translation of the Bible, open it up and try to understand the weird things that are written there. So, I would think that this and other parts of his historical corpus were written really for Jews and were kind of incomprehensible to even a highly educated Roman reader. Josephus was debating in his historical works and passages like this. He was debating with silent voices, that is, with voices that are silent in his works. He doesn't give equal time or hardly mentions the views he's arguing against. But they weren't silent in his own world of the first century. He wasn't writing in a vacuum. Rather, he was directly involved in his public history in the internal and anguished debate or dialectic or polemic, call it what you want, among Jews after the destruction about the meaning of it and what we should do now. He heard a lot more than we're able to hear, and he reacted to it. There are quite a few Jewish authors whose names we don't know, who wrote books after the destruction, in the decades after the destruction of the Second Temple. And they reflect the almost desperate debates over the obvious pressing questions. What was and is God's intention? What were his reasons for allowing or bringing on the destruction? How do we understand the catastrophe in light of Jewish history, in light of world history, in light of predicted history? We thought we understood it. Is redemption far or near? How do we, and then interestingly enough, some of these books deal with the question, how do we explain our survival? Why did we survive when so many die? How can this be part of God's plan? And these books also were written, including Josephus, to encourage and console people, to encourage them to keep faith in the law, to adhere to the law, lead moral lives. And some books, a relative few, but some books counseled, hinted, or openly advocated continuing the rebellion. And this is what most enraged and worried Josephus, and the ones against he most vigorously polemicized. So as I said, one response, it's a minority view, but one response after the destruction was continue actively to rebel. For example, this is the explanation of Masada, if you ask me. And it is why Josephus so detested the Jewish rebels at Masada, whom he saw as symbolizing the suicidal tendency, a suicidal tendency in the Jewish people. The leader of the families and rebels and their families at Masada, fewer than 1,000 people, the leader named Elazar ben Yair, was a messianic figure. He was in a line of messianic figures. And he led his followers to Masada from Jerusalem in 66 when the war broke out. He was disgusted with the priesthood and lay leadership, the establishment in Jerusalem, and he's probably also in contention with other leaders who claim to be the Messiah or the Messiah's prophet. And he and his followers spent the entire war, in that remote desert fortress until 74 CE, when the Romans came to get them too. They must have viewed the destruction in Jerusalem. Now, I'm really guessing here because we don't know, but I can imagine, or one could imagine, that the extreme rebels in Masada, who had rejected the entire Jerusalem establishment and retreated to the desert, they could have viewed the destruction in Jerusalem as a confirmation of their views, as confirmation of their actions and of their leadership. God did that because the temple leadership was corrupt and wrong. Yeah, and then they could have found confirmation of this in the angry prophets who railed against, again, the priestly establishment and people who claimed to lead. And they were certain. This is clear, and I think I could say this with more certainty, that the Masada groups were certain that they would prevail over the Romans with God's help at Masada in bringing in a period of peace and prosperity for the righteous. Of course, they were wrong about that. Let me just say a word about Chazal. I'm not going to say very much about him. I see here among listeners some very wise Talmud scholars, and I'm not going to say much. Let me just say that I think, do not think that Josephus or the books I'm going to discuss, was in direct dialogue with the rabbis of his generation, the rabbis of Mishnah, early Midrash. And if their teachings were in the air, as it were, he could have been responding indirectly. But this is a large topic, which is worth not only another lecture, but really another course or lifetime of study. The causes of the rebellion leading to the destruction. I've already mentioned some of the classic ones: sinat chinam, internal conflict, lack of love and generosity, fighting over trivial matters. I've seen on the internet many stories, many discussions of the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the rebellion breaking out because of a trivial and difference and sort of ayin sarah, as it were, a narrow heart. And other sins like corruption and greed are blamed as well. But the big problem for the historian, is why I'm not going to really get into Chazal, is chronology. The response is a complex matter developed over many generations. It's layered, embedded in the Talmudim and other rabbinic texts. Let me just mention, without making a definitive statement, a response by one of the rabbis of that generation, Yochanan ben Zakkai, who famously by deceit escaped the rebels who controlled Jerusalem and presented himself to the Roman general Vespasian and asked for Yavne. In a very late midrashic work, a supposed teaching of Yochanan ben Zakkai is preserved. He says, if you have a sapling in your hand and it is said to you, behold, there's Messiah, keep planting, and afterwards go and see if he's really there. If the youths, important, say to you, let's go up and build a temple, don't listen to them. The other, I won't talk about them, they're actually later. What had changed before the war was not the understanding of the past or future, but certainty about the present. And if this is genuine Yochanan ben Zakkai, one could say that he learned from the disaster to be skeptical about enthusiastic certainty about what's happening or will happen. But as I said, I don't think Josephus was in direct dialogue with them, but he was, I think, in direct dialogue with other Jewish voices, other authors who are also desperately seeking, urgently seeking answers. Some of these voices, as I said, are preserved in a fascinating but underread Jewish literature, a group of books written in the decades following the destruction in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, the main languages of the Jews then, who were searching and trying to make meaning out of this and come up with answers. And they came up with answers similar to those of Josephus with key differences. These are not books that you would read in a Jewish day school or even a yeshiva, or even actually in college curricula in Jewish studies, except at higher levels. It's important to emphasize that these authors whom I'm going to mention are not connected to Chazal, to the rabbis or rabbinic traditions. They weren't necessarily even in writing from Judea, although most of them were. So let me just give a brief summary, kind of a catalog of book titles, if you were, to give you a flavor of this literature. And I'll talk about one work in more detail in particular. So the first one, and again, I sort of struggled to find appropriate images. Some of these you'll see in the library. This is the fourth book of Ezra I want to talk about. This is a modern edition of it, and it's included in this polyglot Bible from the 16th century, which is in the library's connection. This book was written originally in Hebrew. Now here we have a typical problem with the many books in this category, Jewish books written in the 2 generations after the destruction, relating to the destruction. That is their transmission. This book was written in Hebrew originally by a Jew, translated into Greek, probably could be for Jewish audiences as well as Christian audiences, and then from Greek into Latin. It survives only in Latin and Syriac. The original Hebrew, even the Greek, have been lost. But there's little doubt among scholars that it was written originally in Hebrew in Judea about 30 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. It relates a series of visions by someone calling himself Ezra or Shealtiel. Ezra, the name of the prophet of the book, is Ezra, but not the same. And the book deals with questions of theodicy, God's justice, and also God's mercy. It worries about the punishment of sin. It mentions and worries about the historical prophecy of Daniel, which he thinks will be imminently fulfilled. I'll get back to that point. He thinks that we're on the threshold of the fulfillment of the Daniel's prophecy. He envisions the end of time coming rapidly in his own lifetime. I'll talk more about this book if and when there's time at the end. Another book written in that same period is two books are called Second Baruch and Third Baruch. The first one on the left is called the Syriac Apocalypse of Baruch. It was written in Hebrew in Judea in the 1st century. And again, the same problem. It was translated into Greek and from Greek into Syriac and Arabic. And in fact, the only surviving manuscripts of this are in Syriac and Arabic. But the original was in Hebrew, 1st century. And the author says he's the biblical Baruch. He's Jeremiah's scribe named Baruch. So this is a kind of literary fantasy or conceit. The book is structured around in threes, around 3 fasts, 3 visions, and 3 speeches to the people. They deal with, again, theodicy, the problem of evil, the reward for righteous behavior, predestination, and the book promises the imminent arrival of the Messiah. The third, what we call Third Baruch, or also called the Greek Apocalypse of Baruch, was written by a Jew after the destruction in Greek. It opens with Baruch weeping over the temple. So we have the original. It opens, some of it. It opens with Baruch weeping over the temple, the same Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe. An angel appears to him and invites Baruch on a tour of heaven, where he sees the heavenly temple in its full glory, as contrast with the ruins on earth. He sees other divine mysteries, which he understands, but he doesn't see God. He actually expected he would see God. He was excited about it, but he was disappointed. But he leaves heaven understanding that the promise represented by the heavenly temple will be fulfilled on earth. That doesn't mean that he thinks, or he's telling his readers, that the third temple will actually be built on earth, but rather it's a vision of heaven on earth, that is the Messianic age. So you can see a kind of a trend in these books. Let me also mention the Apocalypse of Abraham, a book also written in Hebrew in the 1st century, maybe early 2nd century, also surviving, this time only in Old Slavonic translation, so that is the Christian translation of it, but the original was in Hebrew, written in the 1st century or early 2nd in Judea. The central character is obviously Abraham. This is Abraham the patriarch, Abraham Avinu, who takes a tour of heaven to learn the future of his people that he founded. He's the patriarch. And he sees 7 visions, including heavenly light and fiery angels, the throne, and in the entire world he sees so he gets a God's eye view of the world. He sees it all ending with the destruction of the Second Temple and God's revelation that the Gentiles will be published and the righteous Jews rewarded with victory. Again, this is a kind of a messianic vision, an end of time vision. The author blames the catastrophe of the destruction on Israel's violation of the covenant. That's a common theme, but also, take note, he blames it on the self-serving political policies of the Jewish leaders. But ultimately, Israel, minus its corrupt rulers, will be triumphant. The author of this work uses Abraham as his main figure to rail against corruption and idolatry, and he even equates collaboration with Rome as idolatry. Now, finally, I'll mention in this kind of report on book titles, just to give you an idea of what was out there, the 4th and 5th Sibylline Oracles. These are 2 books in the library's collection. It's hard to explain what these were. There is a large book called the Sibylline Oracle, which has come down to us in various Greek manuscripts. This is a collection of 12 Greek poems called the Sibylline Oracles. The oracles uttered by the priestess or the prophetess Sibyl. The Sibyl wasn't actual; they were actual ancient prophetesses called Sibyl, of which there were many across the ancient world, from really in ancient times in antiquity itself. The collection includes poems written over a period of about 1,000 years in Greek hexameters and in Greek Homeric verse. But two of these poems were written by Jews after the destruction in 70. There was actually more poems probably authored by Jews, but the two were written by Jews after the destruction in 70. These are what are called the fourth and the fifth Sibylline oracles, and they are exciting, wild and exciting works. Here we have two Jewish authors writing in Greek after the destruction, the first and maybe early second century, pretending to speak in the voice of an ancient Greek priestess or prophetess, the Sibyl. And they write in an ancient Greek literary form, the Homeric meter, to predict the future, because that's what the Sibyl did. She predicted the future. And in her voice, these Jewish authors review the world history and Jewish history according to strict Jewish schemes. They condemn Israel's evil enemies, especially Babylon and Rome, and they exhort Jews to live pious lives despite the traumas that they have experienced. And they predict the future. As I said, this is what Sibyls did in the pagan world. And their future is visions filled with terrific violent upheavals, continuing violence after the temple's destruction. In the fourth Sibylline oracle, the Sibyl says something like you ain't saying nothing yet, which was pretty tough, I imagine, for Jews who witnessed the destruction of the temple to hear or read. And the fifth Sibylline oracle ends with a cataclysmic battle of the stars, which, not to be too flippant about it, seems worthy of a Hollywood special effects department. But the Sibyls in the Jewish versions, speaking the words written by their Jewish authors, predict the final judgment and a peaceful end to all who lead moral and pious lives. These two works, the fourth and the fifth Sibylline oracles, were also noticeable for the appearance of Nero. Nero, the Roman emperor, the one who, he didn't fiddle while Rome burned because the fiddle hadn't been invented yet, but he sang while Rome burned. It probably actually happened, or it could have happened. Nero, who was this young, voluptuous, notoriously irresponsible Roman emperor who died by his own hand in the year 68 of the Common Era. But according to tradition, which is taken up in these two Jewish books, he didn't die, but he fled to the east, where he hid and waited for the moment of the apocalypse to return in dramatic, fiery glory. You can really read this. Nero was the Elvis of antiquity, because for the 200, or actually more than 200 years after he died, he was spotted again and again all throughout the East. People were convinced he didn't die. And he was a kind of a symbol of hope, of redemption. Even if he was himself an evil, sinful character, his appearance represented the coming end, the final redemption. There's even a rabbinic tradition that Nero didn't die, but fled east and converted to Judaism, and Rabbi Meir was descended from him. This is in Gittin, Nun Vav 56, which is that rich treasury of legends, rabbinic legends of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, and that little story about Nero is told there. So he became a figure that took on associations like vengeance, violence, retribution, at the end of days, final redemption. For the Christians, he was the Antichrist. But these two Jewish authors of the fourth and fifth Sibylline oracles were obviously excited by the tradition and used him as the symbol of the coming of the final days, and put him in their books. So these are just some of the books. I haven't mentioned them all, and I'm sure there were more like them that didn't survive. These barely survived in translations of translations. They were written in the wake of the trauma of the temple's destruction, and the first 2 generations after 70. I don't think that these were esoteric books written for small circles of initiates. At least most of them weren't. I think they were written for as wide a Jewish audience as possible. And that's why the Hebrew ones were translated into Greek. Already, I think, for, among others, a Jewish audience, those Jews who couldn't read Greek. Who couldn't read Hebrew. Greek was like the English of antiquity. And they reflect, these books reflect almost in an intimate way what the Jews were thinking and feeling and wanting and hoping for after the destruction. Now, they do contain elements like Echa, written last night. Here's a little bit from the Syriac apocalypse of Baruch. He says, "Blessed is he who was not born. Woe that I was born. He having been born has died. But as for us who live, woe unto us, because we see the afflictions of Zion and what has befallen Jerusalem." And then he says, "Make lamentation with me, ye farmers, sow not again." There's no point in planting your crops. There's no point in harvesting fruits. There's no point in planting vine, because all is lost. The temple is gone. No first fruits will ever be offered again. This is a lament, a kina, as it were, in this work that barely survived. But to repeat, most of these books urgently addressed the existential questions of the day, which is, what was God's intention? The Odyssey, how do we understand the destruction? Is redemption far or near? They were also written to encourage the people to keep faith and adherence to the law. They give different answers to these questions. They have different styles, but there are things that they have in common. First of all, in most of these books, it was Jewish sin that led to the destruction, and Rome was God's instrument. They differ about the Romans. For some, they're vengeful. They want to take revenge on the Romans. There's different levels of loathing of the Romans. But they usually don't directly blame the Romans, because they all understand that Rome was God's instrument. Most of these books counsel withdrawing, separating from Roman society. And they are not focused usually on the rebuilding of the temple. They're focused rather on mitzvot, on keeping the covenant, on leading a moral life. Almost all of these works, at least that I've read, are aware of and sometimes obsessed with the prophecy of Daniel. Remarkably, most of them maintain that it is about to be imminently realized. That is, in the popular Jewish literature, following the destruction of the temple, we find a persistent belief that what we fought for, the miraculous happening predicted by the prophet Daniel, will still happen. And now, or almost now, the destitution of the temple site was confirmation that the prophecy will be fulfilled. This was not a call for resistance, but for observance of the Torah, making us worthy to God, who will soon bring the end, ensuring our salvation. So the tendency in these books, at least, was, yes, it's about to happen in our life, but let's leave it in God's hands. Don't take up arms now. So I want to focus, zoom in on one of these books, so you can get really a better flavor of it. I'll focus on 4th Ezra. But let me actually add a comment. Here's the next, and I'm not actually going to say as much about this than I thought I would, because I see the time is flowing fast. I just wanted to comment on the trend that I just mentioned in these books, that the prophecy is true. It was true when we fought for the temple. After the temple is destroyed, it's even truer now. It's about to be fulfilled. That is, disaster enhanced instead of destroying belief. The belief was just as strong, maybe even stronger. The only adjustment we have to make is in timing, and we were off by a few years only. We have questions about those who died, about the atrocities we saw, whether this was really necessary, but nonetheless, it's going to happen in our lifetimes. Now, the books we don't have, if they existed, are those that openly counseled, directly, blatantly counseled, taking up arms now. The midwives, it's still our task. Obviously, there was such a belief because there were Jewish rebellions in Egypt in the first century, in the second century, and then, of course, the Bar Kokhba revolt. But that's not the trend we find in the literature, Jewish literature, that did survive. I'm not going to talk then much about, there's a lot of scholarship, including those who deal with ancient Jewish apocalyptic, about inspired by this pioneering book by the social psychologist Leon Festinger, When Prophecy Fails, who talks about disconfirmation in Messianic movements can actually strengthen faith. This Festinger, by the way, is the same psychologist who invented the term cognitive dissonance. And this is what we're dealing with, cognitive dissonance. Messianic movements, when meeting with adversity or setbacks, do what Alec Baumgarten, who's a professor at Bar Ilan, a retired professor at Bar Ilan, he calls upping the ante, which raises the stakes for the entire group. So say what you want about that. And by the way, the book on the right is just one of the latest. This has been there's voluminous scholarship on Festinger. This is a recent volume which deals with this theory. But say what you want about all of that. The belief that Daniel was still true and about to take place had the effect of keeping Jews closer to the Torah, closer to mitzvot. For observance was now even more urgently necessary than before. Now let's look briefly, as briefly as I can, at one of these books more closely. And that's 4th Ezra, or what's called 2nd Esdras in Christian Bibles. This is not in the National Library. This is in Florence. It's called the Codex Amiatinus. It is the earliest. This is the Ezra, before the book of Ezra. In the Latin Bible, it's the earliest surviving complete manuscript of the Latin Bible, Vulgate version of the Bible, produced in about 700 in northern England. It made its way to Italy and is now in Florence. This book, as I said, 4th Ezra, was written in Hebrew, surviving in Latin translation in probably Judea, possibly by an eyewitness to the destruction. He says he was writing 30 years after the destruction of our temple. He actually, on the surface, meant the first temple, but it's in coded language. He really means the second temple, as we say in Hebrew, Hamavin Yavin. We don't know who the author was. He identifies himself as Ezra, or Sha'altiel, who has a vision after the destruction of the temple. In fact, he describes, in very poetic and biblical language, in Latin at least, a series of visions. In each vision, there's something that bothers him. These are questions that are at the heart of Judaism, like, again, God's justice and mercy, the punishment of evil, and so forth. In the first vision, he asks God, why does Rome, Israel's enemy, prosper? The answer is basically, God's ways are inscrutable, you'll never understand. In fact, he's told in a verse that might remind you of something else, he says, God said to me, go, weigh for me the weight of fire, measure for me the measure of wind, call back for me the day that is past. If you can do that, you'll understand my ways. This sounds like Iyov, perhaps, one of the most prolific sufferers in history. He's also told in the first reading, the end is coming very soon. And he has shown signs of the end. I won't go into them. They're bizarre, but signs of the end usually are bizarre. That's the nature of signs of the end. Blood shall drip from wood, the stone shall speak, people shall be troubled, stars shall fall. There's a whole series of signs that will happen showing that God am about to bring about the end. In his second vision, he asks, why was I born? Why did I have to see the travail of Jacob? And he even says, he asks, why can't we, all the generations of Israel have been created at once and experience the final judgment now? Why do we all have to wait? Why have to be staggered like this? He's told, don't worry, the end is coming soon. And he sees other signs of the end. In the third vision, he says, why can't Israel possess its inheritance? Why can't we go into the promised land? The answer he gets, don't worry, the Messiah is coming soon. Ezra asks, why are the number of saved so small? This is survivor's guilt. And he tries to intercede like Abraham for the guilty. But the answer he gets from God is, worry about your own soul. The wicked deserve their punishment. And he has even further signs of the end. I won't get into those. Then we come to the really remarkable and more poetic part of this book. Ezra sees 4 visions, all of which foretell the imminent coming of the Messiah and the fall and humiliation of Rome. The first is a weeping woman who was barren for 30 years. She had a child, brought him up. He dies on entering the wedding chamber, and her grief at the loss of her child is uncontrollable. She wants to die. Ezra meets her, hears her story, and admonishes her. He says, people haven't you seen what's going on? He's talking about the destruction. People have lost a lot more than one son. Stop your grief. And then she transforms into a shining city. And here's the shining city. Behold, a woman was no longer visible to me, but there was an established city, a place of huge foundations showed itself. This, of course, is Zion, is Zion, and again, it's the city, the promised vision of the Messianic era. Now, the fifth vision. This is maybe the last thing I'll say about this and then I'll jump to conclusions. Is one of the weirdest, but I think one of the most fascinating parts of this book. It's the so-called eagle vision. He sees an eagle with 12 wings and 3 heads. It's very clear that the 12 wings represent the first 12 emperors, and the 3 heads represent the last 3 emperors, who are all of one family, the Flavian family, Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian. This is an illustration not from our library, at least I don't think it's there, which was made by the artist John Landseer as a headpiece to this book, printed in London in 1815. And I have to say, I made the mistake of going to the internet, going online to find an illustration of the eagle vision. I thought in my innocence that there might be a nice 16th century woodcut or something like that. What I found instead was delirium on Christian apocalyptic sites, citing this prophecy of the eagle as immediately relevant to their times. Now, they interpret it in much different ways. This book is, in fact, in the Catholic Bible with added chapters, not written by the Jewish author, 2 at the beginning, 2 at the end, with Christian content. So they were the book was modified and put into the Christian Bible. But what the author meant with this weird vision of 12 wings was that the history of Rome is 12 emperors, and the last 3 are the ones which we're dealing with. And we're on the 12th wing and the 3rd head. In other words, this is really the end. And what he meant to say by this is that we're going to see the fall of Rome in the lifetime of one mortal man, who was the 12th and last Caesar, the 3rd Flavian. This, to me, is an indication this was written actually in the time of Domitian, the 3rd Flavian, the 12th emperor. The lion, then comes a lion. A lion is part of this vision, and he says, among other things, the remaining had disappeared, and he interprets the vision to Ezra as just exactly what I said, that the Messiah is coming. This is the last head. It's going to happen in your lifetime because this guy's going to die pretty soon, and we're all going to experience the blessings of the Messianic age. The last issue that is dealt with in this book, of 4th Ezra, is why there are so few that survive. This bothers him, and he never really gets what he considers to be a satisfactory answer to this. The 7th vision, which I won't talk about, I'm going to conclude in a minute, is Ezra says that all the Torah and the Bible was burnt. So he, in a vision, writes from the beginning all 24 books of the Bible, 24 in his day, as well as 70 books that were hidden away. And he sees it as an inspired vision like Moshe. And that's the end of this really quite extraordinary book written by a Jewish author in the 2 or 3 decades after the destruction of the temple. So in conclusion, what did the destruction not destroy? This was my title. It, first of all, and most importantly, did not destroy belief and faith in God. That was part of one's existence. Adjustments had to be made, questions had to be asked, but the belief in God and his direct involvement in human affairs for a supreme purpose, which we may or may not understand, this was never doubted. Also, what was not destroyed was obsession with historical time and the end of time. What was not destroyed was the unshakable belief in the truth of prophecy. The problem is ours in calculation, but not in the problem. The problem was not in the prophecy. And in fact, most of our post-destruction sources, think Jewish sources, think that the end, even more violent, this is breathtaking, even more violent than the destruction itself, this end is imminent. And this, by the way, is the belief against which Josephus wrote most vigorously. This is the one that most upset him and why he writes about it so insistently and urgently. Also not destroyed was the belief in the election and eventual triumph, not of all Israel, but of the righteous of Israel. And this is a problem that most of the books I mentioned and others I haven't mentioned deal with in different ways. In the meantime, our authors say, and this includes Josephus, live the Torah, do the mitzvot, lead moral lives. And this can be done without the temple in this time and in this world. With that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much for staying and listening. I'll now ask, here, let me stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Sure.
There are a few questions.
Sure.
Lana asked, did any books written in Hebrew about temple destruction survive? We see mostly translations of these books.
That's right. We have no complete text of, so far as I know, any of these books in Hebrew, fragments here and there. The Hebrew author, the Hebrew language, the Hebrew makor, the Hebrew source for most of these texts is usually guessed or known pretty reliably, I would say, by Semiticisms, syntactic structures, which are obviously imitating an original Hebrew text. But no, you can't read these books in the original Hebrew, I'm sorry to say. I wish we could. This is what we live every day, those who work in ancient history, right? We wish for things that aren't, and we can't have them.
Thank you very much. I do want to say that I put in the chat a link to our website with the future events, past events, and also this event will go up there online in a few days. There's also a link for a survey in Hebrew that we're doing on the content of our events, and another link that you can donate if you so wish. Another question that I got was, what, if anything, can we learn from all this regarding current affairs or current attitudes, religious or otherwise?
There I'm going to be a little bit evasive because I would ask you to read the books and draw those conclusions on yourself. You know, as I in another context, I came here really more to present historical situations and problems without trying to attempt drawing direct linear connections between antiquity and today. Let me just say so, and again, I'm not a rabbi or a preacher, so I really wanted to fulfill the role as a historian. But I will say this: that the questions that the ancient authors and thinkers dealt with are more or less the same questions we deal with today in our existence as Jews in this troubled and dangerous world. They offered answers. We can check in history whether those answers were successful or not, and learn or not learn from the answers that they gave in their predicament. But of course, they were intending to talk about to their immediate generation, perhaps future generations as well, if it didn't happen right away. So we can actually make general comparisons and see, yeah, we're asking the same questions. What does God mean by this? Where is God's justice? Why are the evil prospering? And we could ask these same questions and read their answers as instructive to us. But I don't want to declare, pedantically, affirmatively from ex cathedra what it all means. I would say go and learn.
Thank you. Ellen asked, atheism does not seem to have been thinkable option in the ancient world.
I think that's true.
Where the air itself was full of gods, as various descriptions would have it, but the idea that the covenant between God and his people had become null does seem to find an echo in some near contemporary accounts, such as the midrashic identification of the anonymous gatherer of sticks of wood on the Sabbath, in Numbers as a self-sacrificing figure, a man who wanted to give his life by being put to death for violating the Sabbath, to show that the covenant was still in force. Even after the sin of the 12 spies and the people's rejection of the plan of going directly to the promised land, and the announcement of the divine punishment for this, would this kind of midrash about a man willingly sacrificing his life for God's law is still in effect when he is punished for violating it qualifies, or does it qualify, I guess, as the rabbi's response to a perceived mood of the times, an argument against the notion that the covenant with God has been abrogated? The whole question is very long, and you can see it in the chat if you want to. I hope I asked correctly.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, let me try to understand. First, let me just say, just to be to be Yotze, as they say in Hebrew, that in the ancient world there were some, I would say, rarefied philosophical circles that speculated about the existence of no gods. I mean, I wouldn't say that it was totally foreign, but on the general level in antiquity, atheism was not an option. And I would say that's even more so far as I know the Jewish world in the Roman Empire, more so then. Now, about those rabbinic texts, well, I will comment, but let me just say that this is, again, something that it's hard to answer by standing on one leg. We have to sit down and read the text and study them together, because I think what we would find in the nuances is not a direct challenge to the existence of God. It's nothing. I don't think I could actually ask, I see some of those on the screen who know more about rabbinic literature than I do, whether this is right or not. But I don't think you see a direct challenge to the actual existence of God, that we live in a godless world, but more of a question of, say, the engagement of God in our lives, the degree of engagement, and kind of desperate existential speculation. Why were we created at all? Was it better to be created or not? These seem like blasphemous ideas, but I think that all these, I mean, again, I should turn to the real Talmudist, but I think that these passages in rabbinic literature, just as mutatis mutandis, lahavdil, similar passages in Greek Jewish works, I think that these doubts, what underlies them all is the existence of God, but the question is, where was he? I think that's a short answer to a long question. And again, if I would invite anyone who has more or different to say about this, who's more versed with rabbinic literature, to answer, and I am. But that would be my short answer. And the longer answer would be, let's sit down and study these texts together, because I think it's really in the nuances where we see what they really believed, on the beliefs on which the pillars on which this speculation rested.
Thank you very much. Marcia asked, did the literature from after the destruction in 70 CE refer to the history of what happened after the destruction of Beit Rishon?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yes, it did. It wasn't its main focus, and usually it took instances or verses especially from the post-destruction prophets, in as much as they shed light on the second destruction. I don't find in those Jewish sources a sustained effort to understand the first destruction. Rather, what happened in their lifetimes, using the first temple instances to understand, just like, for example, in Echa Rabbah, right, where the first temple instances are used to understand this midrash, this rabbinic midrash on Echa, are used to understand what happened in the second temple. And of course, the Jewish belief was, and even Josephus says this, that the destructions happen on the same day. Josephus uses this as a sign that it was all God's will. So one event informs the other, and this is very common in Jewish historical conception. The basic history is collapsed, right, into typical events, and the separation, chronological separation, is not necessarily meaningful, because one informs the other as if they happen right after the other or simultaneously. So yes, there is, but it's basically in the service of understanding their own horrible critical predicament.
Yeshua, thank you very much. There's many compliments in the chat. I will send you the transcript so you can see who and what.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
What is it by those that are selling?
Thank you.
Thank you.